Most of us would agree that freedom of speech is very important. It's one of those things that you think about and you kind of just go like, "Oh yeah, that's something that we have. That's cool, let me take that for granted." But if that's true, if freedom of speech is so important, then why does it always seem to disappear into the void of censorship when power consolidates? The more I think about freedom of speech, the more it becomes clear to me that without this fundamental right, literally every other right falls apart like dominoes. Without this right, you can't protest other rights being taken. We can't demand fair elections. We can't hold our leaders accountable. We can't defend our faith. We can't defend sciences. We can't defend arts. You can't defend your identity. If we forget the importance of freedom of speech, then we are just doomed to a future of censorship and surveillance. And the scary part is that most people don't even notice this process when it's happening. Because freedom of speech isn't just the right to say what you want and to worship who you want. It's not just the right to protest. It's the thing that keeps power from being clandestine. And once you understand that, you will understand why freedom of speech is always the first liberty that is always taken by authoritarian powers. But in order to understand where censorship actually comes from, we have to understand what freedom of speech really is and what it means. Now, back in the day, we made this Constitution thing. You may have heard of that. And as it turns out, the first amendment in this Constitution is freedom of speech. The absolute first amendment of our founding rights is the right to freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom to protest, all that sort of stuff. It is the first one. It's not like they were like, yeah, guns are great, that should be the first one, and then, yeah, due process, that's a pretty good idea, and then down at 15, there's freedom of speech. No. It's number one. And like I said, it's number one because if you don't have freedom of speech, all the other rights just fall away. Now, what it really actually means in this country, it's pretty broad. It means that you have freedom of religion. You can worship who you want. It means that you have freedom of speech. You can say what you want. It means that you're allowed to protest. If the government does stuff that you don't like, you're allowed to let them know. You're allowed to assemble. And it means that the press is allowed to exist and that the press is allowed to be free as well. It's allowed to scrutinize the government and it's allowed to disseminate that information to you and to me. Now, there's of course limits on free speech. There's limits on all of our rights. You can't say whatever you want. You can't incite a riot. You know what I mean? So there's limits to our free speech, but generally speaking, that's what it means. But freedom of speech didn't come about because societies became enlightened one day. It came about because people were fucking tired of authorities abusing their silence. Because back in the day, dude, when we didn't have democracies and shit, freedom of speech was not a thing. You weren't allowed to say what you wanted. You weren't allowed to protest. You weren't allowed to worship a different religion. If the press existed at the time, they weren't allowed to scrutinize the government or the king. And so if we imagine we live in that world where we live under a king or we live in a society where censorship is enforced, if I speak ill of the king, what happens to me? If I speak ill to the wrong person, those guards will find me, they'll take me out of my house, they'll try to arrest me, but if they were able to capture me, they would arrest me, no trial, a few days later, and you're hung. Nothing reasonable about that from today's standards. And you were hung in the public square. That way everybody saw it so that they wouldn't speak ill of the king. And so I know that it's just as clear to you as it is to me why this is the First Amendment. It's because it's the most important one, because it is the foundational pillar on which all the other ones stand. Back in the day, if you criticized the king, that was treason. You guys want to live like that? Do you want to live in a world where criticizing somebody on social media is grounds to get you imprisoned? Or worse? Freedom of speech has always been the most important right because it allows people to question authority and to question leaders. And authority and leaders have always been uncomfortable with it because once speech is controlled, surveillance is really easy. Freedom of speech is an engine of truth in a way because when you don't have censorship, you have more ideas flourishing around and the truth kind of bubbles to the top at that point. And I would argue that having freedom of speech, people that spoke out against the government, people that spoke out against things, the dissenters, those are the people that make change happen. All these things start as unpopular ideas, but when you have freedom of speech, unpopular ideas can become popular ideas, because what's popular might only be popular because of censorship. When we talk about the abolition of slavery or the right for women to vote, these things started out as unpopular ideas, and it is my belief that we can never quell people's speech, ever, no matter what it is. We can put limits on it, which is fine. But if this guy over here really wants to be a Nazi, he's allowed to be. And this is a principled stance, because if he's allowed to be a Nazi, then I'm allowed not to be. Because it's not about who should be able to say something, it's about what they say. Things that other people say force you to challenge your assumptions, they force you to challenge your beliefs, and they force you to defend your positions. They force you to think more critically. And on the positive end of the spectrum, this fosters innovation, creativity, things like that. And a society that doesn't have freedom of speech just ends up stagnating. Now, there's a fundamental aspect to censorship and authority. When a bunch of people tell you that you're doing a bad thing, it kind of makes you feel bad. You become embarrassed. When people get embarrassed, it hurts our pride. When people are prideful, stubborn, arrogant, or some combination of these adjectives, their reaction to this is generally with the maturity of a fucking 6-year-old. And instead of being able to take an inward look, they become angry out of their embarrassment. So now we have angry power guy who can't stand to have his pride hurt. This person is the center of power. And so the default resolution is to remove the thing causing the embarrassment, to silence it, to censor it. And depending on how detached from reality this person is, their answer might just be jail or death. People, generally speaking, don't like authority. They don't like being told what to do, who to love, how to act, what to think, any of that shit. We kind of formed a fucking country on that sentiment. And that is why this is always, every single time, without fail, the first fucking thing that is attacked by authoritarians. Because it's the most dangerous thing to their legitimacy. Like, look at Russia, dude. Look at China. Look at North Korea. Authority has always tried to censor information that's critical of them. And without freedom of speech, censorship just becomes the default. And in each case, the pattern is exactly the same. Control the narrative, you control the population. It doesn't begin with soldiers on the street. It begins subtly. Restrictions on what can be broadcast, what can be searched for. Restrictions on what can be published. Certain topics become sensitive, you know what I'm saying? Some phrases and words start becoming dangerous. Sometimes they start becoming illegal. And so over time, censorship doesn't even just silence people. It literally reshapes reality. This is what we were talking about in 1984, the book by George Orwell. When a state gets to decide what information is permissible or what things can be broadcast, then information and truth become subordinate to the power it be. Because it doesn't just work by erasing information or by making information unaccessible. It straight up narrows the boundaries of thought. If some opposing view of the king can never reach the public square, well then there can never be any discussion about it. If leaders are never criticized, then they never face any accountability for anything. And that's really the real problem that I have with censorship. Because it makes the conditions for a free society, it makes them impossible. But it's worse than that, right? Because censorship can't exist on its own. Censorship needs to be enforced. And you enforce this through surveillance. Because if censorship defines what can and cannot be said, surveillance becomes the norm and you're watched. Anything that you speak is then surveilled to make sure that you're complying with the censorship. This is a deeply psychological phenomenon. People will literally begin to censor themselves because they're worried that they will be punished. Not because they already have been. You just need to create an environment where everybody thinks that dissent will be prosecuted. And it turns your fear into compliance. Your phones are tracked, your messages are tracked, your online activity is tracked, you go anywhere in public and there's cameras everywhere, and then past all that, all your data is being collected by every possible thing ever. And the justification for surveillance is always the same. Public safety, national security. But that's just not the practical outcome. The practical outcome is that people internalize their misgivings and their grievances. They're a lot more conservative in the way that they speak. When you know that absolutely everything you're doing is being scrutinized, well, now you're probably afraid to organize that protest, huh? Better be careful about the words that you say, huh? And this is how censorship evolves from policy into culture over time. In this kind of environment, freedom of speech technically kinda still exists, but it's only on paper. Because over time, the boundaries of thought just become more and more narrow. And it's not because all these ideas have been scrubbed from the internet and they're all gone. It's because people will always have those ideas. The problem is that they won't want to express them anymore. So what's my opinion on the whole thing? Taking a look at where we're headed. It's not good, guys. Right now, if you criticize the government, you're basically put on a watch list, like a terrorist watch list. NSPM 7. We recently all saw that several news broadcasters were arrested because all they were doing was covering a protest that was taking place. They weren't participating in the protest. They were just there at the protest. They were arrested. I believe they're all out at this point. But that happened. They're being charged. News publications that have been critical of the current administration have been sued into silence or into compliance. And we already see the surveillance networks taking shape. If you guys haven't heard of Palantir, go check that out. If you guys haven't heard of flock cameras, go check that out. Like, at what point did we just fucking forget absolutely everything that we learned? It wasn't that long ago, guys. 250 years ago. Did people from 250 years ago really have better cognitive reasoning skills than we do today? This is the main freedom, guys. Freedom of speech. This is the fundamental freedom that is the pillar of all others, because without it, everything else falls apart. You can't worship who you want. You can't love who you want. You can't think what you want. You can't do what you want. Now, we're all in agreement that freedom of speech is really important. So what we need to do going forward is protect it. Criticize your leaders. Protest. Worship. Say, think, and believe. And I'll see you guys in the next video.